Te Namaha. Sri Ramakrishna, he used to say, all jackals howl alike. So what he meant by that is that all the great God-realized souls and saints of different countries, from the West, from India, from other countries, they all, once they realize God, they all speak about the highest spiritual truths in the same language, in the same way. And to illustrate that point today, I wanted to talk about a remarkable American woman saint who realized God. She was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts in the US. So I want to talk about her. How did I hear about her in the first place? It's quite interesting. I was in training center in Pilgrim a few years ago, and Swami Medhanandaji, who's currently the president of the Bangalore Matha in Basavanagudi in Bangalore, he was one of my acharyas. And he told me one day, he said, you should read the life and teachings of the Peace Pilgrim. And I'd never heard of the Peace Pilgrim, but he said, the book is in the library, get it and you'll enjoy it. She teaches nothing but Vedanta. That's what he told me. So then I got the book from the library and I was really amazed by it. And I want to just talk to you a little bit today about the life and teachings of the Peace Pilgrim, this American saint. So as I mentioned, she was born in Boston in the first decade of the 20th century. And she wasn't raised in a religious household. She wasn't born or raised Christian or in any other religion. But she was a remarkable person. And in high school, it came from within. She started asking about spirituality and about religion. And so she went from person to person asking, what is God? What is God? This should remind us of what Swami Medhanandaji used to say when he was a young teenager, before he met Sri Ramakrishna. He went around Kolkata asking people, have you seen God? Have you seen God? And nobody could answer in the affirmative. So in the same way, she went around asking people when she was a high school student, what is God? What is God? And nobody could give her a satisfactory answer. And from a very young age, she wasn't interested in worldly pleasures. She just had this impulse from within to dedicate her life to God. So one day, as a teenager, she was walking in the woods. And this is in her own words. She said, I felt a complete willingness without any reservations to give my life, to dedicate my life to service. Please use me, I prayed to God. And a great peace came over me. So it was at that moment that she felt that her whole life's endeavor would be to surrender herself to God completely and to serve humankind, seeing God everywhere. After that insight, that sort of conviction, she spent 15 years in very intensive spiritual sadhana. And her sadhana took many different forms. She did a lot of nishkama karma. She did a lot of selfless service, serving the poor, serving the needy, serving the mentally handicapped, the physically disabled, the elderly. And she was also at the same time practicing an inner sadhana. And she described it as fighting with her lower nature, with her ego. It's what Swami Vivekananda called the rascal ego. So she was also fighting her lower selfish impulses at the same time, as we all have to do as sadhakas and as sadhikas. And she felt again from within a need to renounce any worldly attachments. And so she did that as well. She never married. She never entered into the householder life. She renounced all meat eating and everything. She became a strict vegetarian and practiced chastity. And she did some very severe austerities at different points in her life. She even did a 45-day fast, eating absolutely nothing, not one drop of water. Somehow, by God's grace, she survived the fast. And on January 1st, 1953, she began what she called her pilgrimage. That's her own word. And she became, remarkably, a Pravrajika sannyasini. She became a wandering sannyasini in the US, which is unheard of. In India, of course, we have a long history of wandering monks like Vivekananda himself and many previous renunciates. But in the US, it's not in the culture at all. But she just felt this impulse from within to, without taking a single cent in her pocket and without any other kind of belongings, she just walked out on the street on her own as basically a nun, and surrendering herself to God completely. And she called herself from then on Peace Pilgrim. Whenever people asked for her name, she said, "I'm Peace Pilgrim." And what she meant by that is she's a wanderer. She's a wanderer who stands for and who tries to promote both inner and outer peace. Outer peace, you should imagine, 1953 means just 8 years after World War II ended. So she was very disturbed by all the violence going on in the world. So that's outer peace. But one of her main teachings is that you can never have outer peace until you have inner peace. So she focused on how people can cultivate inner peace by surrendering and depending on God. And one of her constant prayers, one of her main sadhanas was prayer, just like Sri Ramakrishna. And she would often pray to God. She would say, "Make me an instrument through which only truth can speak." It's a very beautiful prayer. And if you've studied the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna would often say, you should pray to God saying, "Ami jontro, tumi jontri" in Bengali, which means, "I'm the instrument, you are the one controlling me. You're the engineer." And after this very intense period of sadhana, of spiritual practice, she realized God. And she described her state of God realization. She said, "To know God is to reflect love toward all people and all creations. To know God is to feel peace within, a calmness, a serenity, an unshakableness which enables you to face any situation. To know God is to be so filled with joy that it bubbles over and goes forth to bless the world. I have only one desire now, to do God's will for me. And knowing God," she continues, "and knowing God is not reserved for the great ones. It is for little folks like you and me. God is always seeking you, every one of you. You can find God if you will only seek, by obeying divine laws, by loving people, by relinquishing self-will, attachments, negative thoughts and feelings. And when you find God, it will be in the stillness. You will find God within." So you can see how Vedantic her teachings are. She didn't study Vedanta in any formal way, but all of her teachings are suffused with the spirit of Vedanta. So I wanted to just explain some of her main teachings, her spiritual teachings, and show some of the parallels with Vedantic teachings. So one of the main things she taught again and again is that we have two selves. We have a lower self and a higher self. And she called them our self-centered nature and our God-centered nature. So this is one statement that she makes. She says, "I was not far down the spiritual road when I became acquainted with what the psychologists refer to as ego and conscience, which I called the lower self and the higher self, or the self-centered nature and the God-centered nature. It's as though we have two selves or natures or two wills with two contrary viewpoints. Your lower self sees things from the viewpoint of your physical well-being only. Your higher self considers your psychological or spiritual well-being. Your lower self sees you as the center of the universe. Your higher self sees you as a cell in the body of humanity. When you are governed by your lower self, you are selfish and materialistic. But insofar as you follow the promptings of your higher self, you will see things realistically and find harmony within yourself and others." So when you hear these teachings, anybody who studied some Vedanta, you could immediately find parallels in Vedantic scriptures. So, of course, one of the most famous is in the Mundaka Upanishad, the famous parable of the two birds. The two birds representing the lower self and the higher self. Swami Medhanandaji, in Inspired Talks, he explains this parable of the two birds in the Mundaka Upanishad. Swami Medhanandaji says, "The whole of the Vedanta philosophy is in this story. Two birds of golden plumage sat on the same tree. The one above, serene, majestic, immersed in his own glory. The one below, restless in eating the fruits of the tree, now sweet, now bitter. Once he ate an exceptionally bitter fruit. Then he paused and looked up at the majestic bird above. but he soon forgot about the other bird and went on eating the fruits of the tree as before. Again he ate a bitter fruit, and this time he hopped up a few boughs nearer to the bird at the top. This happened many times, until at last the lower bird came to the place of the upper bird and lost himself. He found all at once that there had never been two birds, but that he was all the time that upper bird, serene, majestic, and immersed in his own glory. And again, very much like Vedanta, Peace Pilgrim described our higher nature, what she called the God-centered nature, as a divine spark. It's a very beautiful language. She says, there is a spark of good in everybody, no matter how deeply it may be buried. It is the real you. When I say you, what am I really thinking of? Am I thinking of the clay garment, the body? No, that's not the real you. Am I thinking of the self-centered nature? No, that's not the real you. The real you is that divine spark. Some call this the God-centered nature, others the divine nature, and the kingdom of God within, as in Christianity. She says, the important thing to remember is that it dwells within you. And in another place, she describes this higher God-centered nature using a beautiful metaphor. She says that in the final analysis, you find spiritual truth through your own higher nature. Your higher nature is a drop in the ocean of God and has access to the ocean. Sometimes your higher nature is awakened through the inspiration of beautiful surroundings or beautiful music, bringing you insights of truth. Sometimes you see the truth written or hear the truth spoken, and your higher nature confirms it. Or you directly perceive the truth from the inside through an awakening of the higher nature, which is my way. So that's one of her main teachings, is that there are two selves, a lower self and a higher self, the self-centered nature and the God-centered nature, which is very much in line with Vedantic teaching. Another one of her teachings is that we are not the body. We are making the mistake of thinking we are the body, but we are actually eternal souls. So she says in one place, in my frame of reference, I am not the body. I'm just wearing the body. I am that which activates the body. That's the reality. If I am killed, it destroys merely the clay garment, the body. This should remind us, if we've studied the Bhagavad Gita from chapter 2, Bhagavan Krishna says, Vasamsi jinnani yatha vihaya. This is a famous verse in the Gita, which says that just as at the end of the day, we cast off our clothes, and then we put on new clothes the next morning. In the same way, after the end of one life, we cast off our physical body, and in the next life, we assume another physical body. So she's using very similar language as the Gita to explain reincarnation. And when she says, if I am killed, it destroys merely the clay garment, not the soul. Again, this should remind us of chapter 2 of the Gita. Ajo nityaha shashvatoyam purano nahanyate hanyamane sharire. Another famous shloka where Bhagavan Krishna says that when the body is killed, the soul within us is not killed, because that soul is eternal and can never die. Now, another one of her main teachings was about the harmony of religions, which again we should know Sri Ramakrishna taught again and again, as many faiths, so many paths. Swami Medhanandaji taught the same thing. And this is what Peace Pilgrim says in the same vein. She said, religion is not an end in itself. One's union with God is the ultimate goal. There are so many religions because immature people tend to emphasize trivial differences instead of important likenesses. Differences between faiths lie in creeds and rituals rather than religious principles. We are all God's children, and there are no favorites. God is revealed to all who seek. God speaks to all who will listen. Be still and know God. So if you've studied Swami Vivekananda's teachings, you'll find that he says this again and again. He says that the essence of religion is realization. The goal of all religions is God realization. And doctrines and dogmas and rituals and temples, these are all secondary details. This is what Swami Vivekananda said. And she's saying exactly the same thing, without having read one word of Swami Vivekananda or Vedanta. Another one of her teachings is about how, for every spiritual aspirant, no matter in what country you're from, each spiritual aspirant is faced with two diverging paths. This is what she says. She says, the Peace Pilgrim says, lovingly I informed my well-meaning friends of the existence of two widely divergent paths in life and of the free will within all to make their choice. There is a well-worn road which is pleasing to the senses and gratifies worldly desires, but leads to nowhere. And there is the less traveled path which requires purifications and relinquishments, but results in untold spiritual blessings. So if you've studied the Upanishads, this should immediately remind you of one of the teachings from the Kathopanishad, from 1.2.1. It's a famous teaching. The mantra says, Shreyascha preyascha manushyametastav samparitya vivinakti dhiraha. And it goes on like this. The mantra in this Upanishad teaches that each person is confronted with two paths, which the Kathopanishad describes as the path of Shreya and the path of Preya. And the spiritual aspirant should choose the path of Shreya. And Swami Vivekananda, when he translates this Upanishadic mantra, he gives a very nice translation. He says that the path of Shreya is the path of perfection, spiritual perfection. And the path of Preya, he calls the path of enjoyment. And exactly in the same way, Peace Pilgrim is saying that there are these two paths. And the one that is well-worn, she says this is the common path. Ordinary people, almost everybody follows this, the path of worldly pleasures. But she says it leads to nowhere, exactly like the Kathopanishad says. And she says the other path, almost nobody dares to go on the path, but this is the path that leads to the highest spiritual fulfillment. And regarding God, she said some wonderful things about God. See, she didn't talk about God with some kind of form. She seemed to believe in a personal God, Saguna Brahman, but Nirakara. In Hindu terms, we can say Saguna but Nirakara. Nirakara means formless. So she believed in the formless personal God. And she realized directly that this personal God was pervading the entire universe. She saw God in everything and in everyone. This is one of her teachings. She says, God is love. And whenever you reach out in loving kindness, you are expressing God. God is truth. And whenever you seek truth, you are seeking God. God is beauty. And whenever you touch the beauty of a flower or a sunset, you are touching God. God is the intelligence that creates all and sustains all and binds all together and gives life to all. Yes, God is the essence of all. So you are within God and God is within you. You could not be where God is not. So again, this should remind us of some of the great Vedantic teachings like Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma, that everything in this world is Brahman. That's from Chandogya Upanishad. And she also says, this is a nice statement of hers, she says, there is really no such thing as an atheist, for within that person is the divine nature, which, when awakened, will feel close to God. Even if people say that I don't believe in God, she says, even within those people, this is exactly what Sri Ramakrishna said, even within those atheists, so-called atheists, there's that divine nature. They just haven't realized that. That's why when Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was a great Pandit in Kolkata during Sri Ramakrishna's time. And Sri Ramakrishna went to visit him. And he was a very good person, a noble soul, and a highly learned person, but he was not so religious. And Sri Ramakrishna noticed immediately that he was a highly sattvic person, but that he explained that within you, I can see the divine nature within you, but there is a very thin layer of clay, of dirt covering it. That's why you don't realize your own divine nature. That's why you're having doubts about whether God exists or not. So in the same way, she's saying that there's really no such thing as an atheist. So this tallies quite nicely with what Sri Ramakrishna would teach. Now, another important question that every spiritual philosophy has to answer is, what is the relationship between the jiva, the individual soul, and God, or Brahman? And she explains this relationship in a very beautiful way. She says, think of God as a divine ocean, and you as one drop with free will. You can choose to remain separate from the ocean, but you won't be happy. You can choose to be a part of the ocean, in which case you will give up your free will, but you will be delightfully happy acting in harmony with God's will. Now you will perceive yourself as a part of God and very much at one with God. So this should remind us of the Bhagavad Gita's teaching, for instance, in chapter 15, verse shloka 7, where Bhagavan Krishna says, Mamevamsho jivaloke jivabhuta sanatanaha Each individual soul is an amsha, is a portion of me. It's a part of me. So exactly in the same way, Peace Pilgrim is saying that each one of us is a part of God. And we suffer because we don't realize that we're part of God. We think we're separate from the divine ocean. That's why we suffer. And we have to keep coming back again and again until we realize this spiritual truth, that we are part of this divine ocean. And regarding reincarnation, and again, remember that she grew up in the US. She was not familiar with, nobody taught her about reincarnation, but she realized the truth of reincarnation and the doctrine of karma through her own spiritual experiences. So she says, Peace Pilgrim says, in each being there is a divine nature called by various names. After sufficient lifetimes, so this is reincarnation, it begins to govern the being. The divine nature begins to govern the being. That being stands out from the crowd. There have been quite a few. The important thing is that it can govern you. So she says that our spiritual journey lasts for many, many lifetimes. And after a certain number of lifetimes, slowly our higher nature, the divine nature, begins to govern the body and the mind. And then eventually we all will become saints. And in a similar vein, Peace Pilgrim says, if the self-centered nature has been completely overcome, the spiritual nature, this is the higher self, the real you, will go to the spiritual realm instead of the psychic realm. It will now no longer need to live more earthly lives and will be learning other lessons. The spiritual nature is always good and always consistent with God's will. It is the self-centered nature that is sometimes passive, sometimes good, sometimes out of harmony. So she's explaining very nicely that so long as we have not realized God, so long as we have not fully realized our own divine nature, we'll have to keep coming back to this earth in new bodies. But once we have realized our higher divine nature, we don't have to come back again. And she says that we go to the spiritual realm rather than the psychic realm. So she's thinking of different lokas. In Vedantic terms, of course, we have the language of lokas. She's using the language of realm. And she gave a lot of teachings about spiritual practice. And one of her main spiritual practices, which she encouraged everybody to practice, was prayer. And again, if you study the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and you ask yourself, what is the main spiritual practice that Sri Ramakrishna teaches again and again, you'll find that Sri Ramakrishna teaches prayer. He would say many times, pray to God sincerely, with yearning, and with tears in your eyes. Kene kene prarthana. So what Sri Ramakrishna meant is, don't just verbally say something without that heart behind it, without the feeling behind it, but you should sincerely pray, and it should come from within, in a spirit of surrender and worship. And exactly in the same way, she would encourage everybody to pray without ceasing. And then she said something nice about the nature of true prayer. She said, praying without ceasing is not ritualized, nor are there even words. It is a constant state of awareness of oneness with God. It is a sincere seeking for a good thing, and it is a concentration on the thing sought, with faith that it is obtainable. All right prayer has good effect, but if you give your whole life to the prayer, you multiply its power. No one really knows the full power of prayer. Of course, there is a relationship between prayer and action. Receptive prayer results in an inner receiving, which motivates to right action. So what she's saying is, don't just verbally pray in a mechanical way, but you should pray, not necessarily even with words, but it should be a kind of a longing for the divine and a sincere surrender and seeking for the divine. And in another place, she explains prayer in this way. She says, Peace Pilgrim says, the most important part of prayer is what we feel, not what we say. We spend a great deal of time telling God what we think should be done, and not enough time waiting in the stillness for God to tell us what to do. So this is a very beautiful teaching. Swami Vivekananda, he said, when you pray to God, don't pray for ordinary things. The highest prayer is, thy will be done. This is what Swami Vivekananda taught. She's saying exactly the same thing. She says, most of us, when we think of God at all, we go to God for these petty things. Sri Ramakrishna would say, most people go to God and pray for vegetables. Please give me some squash, give me some bitter fruit, these things. He says, why should you go to God for these petty things? Go to God for the highest things, renunciation, viveka, devotion, knowledge. And so Peace Pilgrim is saying the same thing, that when we pray, we should pray to God that we can become perfect instruments of God's will. And not, oh God, please make sure that my child does well in her exams, or make sure my son is married to a nice girl. These are very worldly prayers. You can do it. It's also okay. Bhagavan Krishna in Gita, he says that there are 4 types of people, and all of them are good. He says, Chaturvidha bhajante mam, janaha sukritinojuna, arto jigyasu rathati jnani cha bharatashava. So Bhagavan Krishna says that 4 types of people worship me, and all of them are good. One of them is, he says, artaha, is the person who in deep suffering. If somebody suddenly gets cancer, or somebody's spouse dies, somebody close to them dies, then they're in deep suffering and they call on God. So Bhagavan Krishna says that's good, because at least they have faith in me, and they call on me in their moment of suffering. And Bhagavan Krishna says, Jigyasu, the Jigyasu also calls on me. That Jigyasu is somebody who simply wants to know, who is God? What is God? I want to realize God. He says that person is also good. Then he says, Arthati. This is probably the majority of people. Arthati are people who pray to God for material things, as I just mentioned. And Krishna says that's also good, because they have faith in me. And at least they have that belief that if they come to me, I will give them what they want. But Bhagavan Krishna says, but the 4th category of bhakta is the highest. He says, who is that person? The jnani. The jnani is the one who spontaneously worships God because he knows and sees nothing but God, because he has realized God. So the great realized souls, like Sri Ramakrishna, like Swami Vivekananda, like Peace Pilgrim, this is the highest type of worshipper of God. So you see that Peace Pilgrim is saying exactly the same thing. And I wanted to just conclude this lecture with a beautiful meditation that Peace Pilgrim would often recommend that people practice in our daily lives. This is the prayer. These are her exact words. And before I read it, because I'll conclude with this, I wanted to mention, if you're interested in learning more about the life and teachings of Peace Pilgrim, there's a nice book called Peace Pilgrim, Her Life and Teachings in Her Own Words. So this is not just somebody else writing, but it's her own words. And you can find it online on Amazon. So this is the meditation that Peace Pilgrim recommends, and you'll find that it's very Vedantic. She says, know that you are God's beautiful child, always in God's hands. Accept God. Accept God's protection. There is really no problem to fear. Know that you are not the clay garment. Know that you are not the self-centered nature which governs your life needlessly. Know that you are the God-centered nature, the kingdom of God within, the indwelling Christ, eternal and indestructible. Identify with the real you. Peace, be still, and know that I am God. Peace, be still, and know that I am. Peace, be still, and know. Peace, be still. Peace, be. Peace, peace, peace. And now, with the knowledge that we are God's perfect children, eternal and indestructible, let us go our separate ways in love, but always remain together in spirit. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.